Hi, Liz. So good to see you.
Good to see you, Teddy.
Glad to have you here. I'm going to do a quick intro and then we'll jump in. So for the first timers out there, this is the Debrief presented by Right Hire. The Debrief is a series of conversations with founders, executives, and thought leaders. I think you check at least two of those three, maybe three of three with the Wiseman Group also. Rare trifecta on how they've built talented and diverse teams. I'm your host, Teddy Chestnut, Right Hire co-founder. And today I am truly thrilled to welcome best-selling author, researcher, executive advisor, founder, executive, and thought leader, Liz Wiseman. Liz, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, it's good to be here. Just all that makes me feel tired suddenly.
Right. Well, I'm sure that hopefully you're feeling a little less tired after just releasing Impact Players. I know that writing a book is no joke. What are you feeling now on the release? Like joy, relief, initially to get started again? Like what's the emotional roller coaster?
I think it's relief because it's so hard when you are writing a book that there's not that many people who know what you're working on, and it's not like you're keeping it secret. It's just no one really cares. So like my family pretends to care, but like you're the one. There's a few number of people who are really into it. And so it's just a relief to have it out so that at least people know what you've been working on, what's been making you a little bit nutty. And it's a set of ideas I want to share with people. So it feels good to just be able to share it.
Put it out there. Wonderful. Well, we are here today to learn from kind of your unique view on how people show up at work and your mission to empower people to become impact players and also maybe even more importantly, rid the world of bad bosses. So I think that's a good mission to run at. Simple, relatable, applies to everybody. Before I even jump in, why that mission, rid the world of bad bosses? Where did it come from?
Well, it came from my experience at Oracle, and it absolutely came from hiring and how Oracle hired. So Oracle, back in that day, they had this trifecta of talent they were looking for, which is really, really smart, achievement-oriented, and nice. And now sometimes they had to compromise on this, and the compromise would have come on nice. Let me tell you.
You get two out of three, but if you're going to pick two, you had to pick a certain two.
Yeah, we knew which two got picked, and I just landed in the sea of all these really bright, incredible, smart people, and I was in awe. And I can't say I felt like an imposter there. I just was in awe of all these amazing, smart people that I worked with. And then I saw how what some bosses did to these really smart people.
Mm.
And that was what ended up leading to this observation of a leader can either multiply the intelligence and capability of people or diminish it. And the diminishing made me angry because I saw all these smart people and I would watch what would happen to them around bad bosses.
Mm.
And for me, it's almost like this liberation of, let people be smart. Like you worked hard to hire them. And it shocks me. See, now you got me all razzed up.
I know that was the whole point. Let's go. Well, let's do the flip side on this. Let's do the flip side. Let's not focus on the bad bosses. Think about, this is a little rapid fire. What's the best boss moment that you were ever a part
of? Probably the most courageous boss moment. Maybe it was when I was working with Oracle's president, chief financial officer, and chief technology officer, and we were running this leadership development program for our executives. And through the course of this, it became clear that the company's strategy wasn't very clear. Mm-hmm. And so we were like, okay, let's next time we run the program, we'll sharpen up our presentation. And then it wasn't really clear to the other executives either. And so we sharpened it up, and it eventually became clear that the strategy was fuzzy and not compelling. And it was these three executives that owned the strategy. And after the third program, I'm going through this participant feedback with them. So I'm sitting with the three of them and I'm going through it, and they're not getting it. They're not seeing it. They don't seem motivated to fix this problem. And so I am kind of go through the feedback one more time to make sure that they understand it. And Jeff, the CFO, who was my boss, he just blurted out, he's like, Liz, you can stop beating us up. We get it. we understand that there's a problem. And then this is like the amazing boss moment for me. Is he said, we understand that there's a problem. We get that the strategy is not clear. He says, we don't know how to solve it. And see, it had never occurred to me that they didn't know how to do this. And he's like, and then he goes on, he's like, we've never done this before. We've never run a $30 billion company. Like, this is new to all of us. And, and then like the chief technology officer and the president, they're nodding their head, like, we don't know how to do this either.
Yeah.
And then Jeff said, like, if you could help us like figure out how to do it, that would be useful. And I thought it was like the most amazing act of leadership I think I've ever witnessed, is for a senior executive to say, we don't know how to do this fundamental thing that we need to be able to do. Can you help us?
Yeah. Vulnerability and empowerment put together.
And, I ended up bringing in C.K. Brahalad from the University of Michigan to work with the four of us. But it was this willingness to say, I'm like, in fast times, everyone's winging it, including the people at the very top of an organization. And I just thought it was the epitome of courageous leadership.
We could wrap right there. That'd be good. We could just, I got you all riled up. You got me all welled up. Like, I don't know, you think about great bosses in those moments, and they get you like emotional because they have a huge human impact on you.
And let me share one more, because that was sort of a great moment of leadership. I'll share one of my amazing boss moments is, I joined Oracle young, and I ended up getting thrown into senior management roles pretty early on. And so there was a pretty big gap between my job and my pay at one point. And, I'd been getting these really healthy raises, and I was appreciative of them. And at one point it was like the annual raise cycle, and my boss, Phil Wilson, who was the head of HR, the senior VP of HR for Oracle, he took his raise recommendations into his meeting with Larry, and there was mine. And I guess it was an obscene percentage increase. And Larry didn't approve it, because he says it's a ridiculous raise. Like, and it was like on a year over year and compared to everything else. And Larry denied it, in some ways rightly so. And Phil, I wasn't in the meeting, of course. It was the chief financial officer who later told me this. He's like, Phil told Larry that if we weren't going to pay Liz based on the job she was doing and the job she was in, he couldn't work at the company and he would need to resign. And Larry agreed to it. And I mean, like, I well up thinking about this. Yeah. And, you think about pay parity and gender issues in the workforce. And I think of what it was like to find out that I had a boss who said, no, we pay her for the job she's doing, not for how old she is. And he, it was and it wasn't about me. It wasn't like he was going to bat for me. For him, it was a principle. Like, no, we are going to do the right thing here. And it wasn't that Larry was going to do the wrong thing. It just looked like a crazy salary increase. That to me was an amazing boss moment.
So we had you got riled up, and then we welled up, and then you just want to run through a brick wall for people.
No, now I just want to reach out to Phil Wilson.
Right. We'll set up.
Thank you.
We're going to talk a lot about how to find people like that, right? Who multiply, who bring out the best in others from a management perspective, from a hiring perspective. Obviously, we think about hiring and interviewing all day, every day. And so before we jump into a lot of the meat, I'm just curious, what's your favorite interview question and why? Like, when you ask it, what are you looking for?
Well, there's a whole set of things that I would look for on a behavioral basis. But one of the questions I like to ask is just, what do you hope to get out of this conversation? And I ask that because I want to know sort of how much of a take charge orientation people have. Like, do they come to an interview with, okay, I'm sort of the victim in this interview, and I'm sitting in the chair, and I'm sort of like at the mercy of whatever tone the person sets and whatever questions, like, I will respond and follow them? Or does the person like come to it with, here's what I want to get out of this. I want to be able to communicate this. I want to understand that. I want to know if are they someone who shows up to a meeting and follows, or do they show up with intent, and an objective? And for me, that's not just an interview question. It's kind of like any kind of like, what do you hope to get out of this meeting?
Right. Well, that
showed up. It was on my calendar.
Right. And that feels like it relates to some of the research that you've done in impact players, where it's like, these are the kinds of people who actually go beyond to get something done. They see things through, they have intent. It feels like it ties to some of what you actually found in the research.
Mm-hmm.
We would hope that the researcher would have a scientific, evidence-based approach to what interview questions you should ask. No, there's no winging it here.
One prize.
Right. All right, I want to start back. You spent a long time at Oracle, which is obviously the foundation for a lot of, ultimately then the work that you did as a researcher inspired a lot of it. For the folks that you don't share a lot in your LinkedIn profile about that experience. I think it's like one line. So I think it'd be helpful for folks to understand, like, what was your highest impact role at Oracle? What was the nature of the work that you're doing there, so we can understand kind of how that experience shaped ultimately then the research that you did, and ultimately how you think about interviewing, hiring, and talent management.
Well, my job fundamentally at Oracle was to run the training operation, and it sort of started small and it got big as the company got big and it was global. And so maybe my highest impact role might have been like building a global talent development operation. I don't think that was the most valuable work I did. The most valuable work I did was probably my night job, and it wasn't even a night job. It was sort of like it was my side hustle inside of Oracle. So it was my side hustle before we had side hustles. And it was just work I fell into. And it was really that moment where, we're running a training program, and it's, we're trying to communicate the strategy, and it becomes clear that the strategy is not clear. It's not compelling. And so I just sort of jump in to this work with these 3 top executives, and the 4 of us are doing it. And it ended up being a process that I led and managed, and we ended up not only building a clear and compelling strategy for the company. And this is a little bit of a history lesson on the internet. This is like, when internet computing has rattled the software industry, and Oracle was in good position for this, but in some ways we were in such a good position for it that we didn't really have to think that hard about how we were handling it. So it caused us to really crystallize what is our strategy for truly distributed and what came to be cloud-based computing and all of that. So it was not only shaping a clear strategy, it was engaging our top 250 executives in that process, so that it was a strategy like built by the masses for the masses. And that was not a job that ever would have been, I never interviewed for that job. I never was assigned to that job. It was just work I fell into because it needed to be done, and I was good at it, and I was in the right place at the right time. But it's probably the highest impact work I did.
It's a really interesting lesson around how to manage your own career. Think about like, how do you advance your career, and the most likely path is not necessarily the job that you're in. It's just the job that needs to be done that nobody else is doing. And if you can fill that space, then you're creating opportunity.
Yeah. And a little bit of chutzpah in that too, because like there was an inflection point where I kind of not only was, harping on, our strategy needs to be clearer, but got kind of fell into the role of being the chief author of that, is I just invited myself to a meeting. Like, I knew the executives were retooling this, and I was happy that it was happening, but I'm like, I feel like I need to be there to help work on that. And so I just showed up to a meeting of, I don't know, probably 10 of, the executives that ran the various product organizations and sales organizations inside the company. And there was one moment where I went I knew where it was, and I knew it was happening. And I went early, got there. And as the various executives were coming in, some of them were like, oh, I thought this was like the product bosses trying to figure out the strategy. Like, what's the training leader doing here? And most were like, okay, that's great. And then one was like, what are you doing here? Like, you're like the training lady, you know, and we're like the product bosses. And I was like, you know, I like understand, but you know, Jerry, here's what has to be done. You have to take a lot of complex information about the products and about the business and distill it down to kind of a simple, clear message. And this is actually something I'm really good at. And I thought that maybe I could be helpful here. And he was still a little bit like, I don't get it. But the president was there, and the president was like, yeah, Jerry, like we're like, pay attention, because like Liz is good at this and we can use her help. And, you know, I knew I would have allies there in that room. And, you know, I sat and listened and paid attention and started making observations and summing up discussions I was hearing. And, you know, next thing I know, I'm like put in charge of this process. But it wasn't like someone scouted out my talent and found me. I just sort of showed up on set.
A lot of what you write about in Multipliers and in Impact Players are these kinds of characteristics of people, right? That you said chutzpah, right? But like person who's going to show up at the meeting when they weren't invited to because they think that they could be valuable there, right? Or the person who, you know, like it risks somebody saying you shouldn't be here, but I'm going to be here anyway. You know, in Multipliers, you talked about like, you know, liberators, challengers, talent magnets, debate makers, investors, and the definitions of those are not, they're not experiences that somebody's had. They're the ways that people operate, ways that people work. I'm curious how you thought about those characteristics as it relates to hiring, right? You were hired in a training role. The job description didn't have those things in it. It had a certain set of things in it that were related to the role, the job that you were supposed to do. Have you worked with executives thinking about the balance between what you hire for, the experiences and the skills that are related to a specific job that you're hiring for, and then all this other stuff that it turns out from your research turns out to be really, really valuable and important with respect to people making an impact at a large scale?
Well, I think one of the things I learned early on at Oracle, and I have a strong bias for this. I know other people have a bias against it, but you know, Oracle was somewhere where they hired for certain kinds of characteristics, sort of like mental orientations, work habits, and then they turned those people loose on problems that they had never solved before. And you know, there was some times where inexperienced people really did some damage, and having some experience really helped. But for the most part, they hired for and they favored orientations and traits and mindsets over experience. And this is something I've just seen the power of, like, people who have a way of working can solve problems that years and years of experience can't without those same ways of working. So I don't tend to hire for experience. I think, you know, you look for these kinds of mindsets and practices and habits. And, you know, my research has been, and this might be because I'm not very good at hiring, and there's a reason why I'm not very good at hiring, is my research has been like, what are the beliefs and the behaviors behind great leaders or great contributors? Mm-hmm. And, you know, some of that is like, so we know, like, what do we look for? And when you build that profile of like, okay, what are the kinds of assumptions and behaviors that create the right kind of result, then you look at that set and go, okay, of these kind of practices and mindsets, which of these are hard to acquire and which of them are fairly easy to acquire? Which of them are, and it's probably because I've spent most of my career running training operations that I've come to realize not everything is super trainable. That there's some things that they're hard to change, certain assumptions that people have. And so it's like the best hiring strategy is hire for the things that are hard to coach and train, and then coach and train for everything else. So it's not just hire for a profile, hire for the parts of the profile that are a little bit indelible.
What are some of the things that you found are really hard to coach and train, that you need to really hire for, not, you know, develop for?
Well, there's a common characteristic. I've done 3 major research projects that have, you know, each turned into 3 major books. And there's a common characteristic across all of them. And that is, I so like, there's like a part of me that so wants to quiz you, Teddy, and like figure out if like.
Let's go.
Okay. So here, okay, this will be fun, and we'll put you on the hot spot for just a bit, and then we'll bail you out. Like I'm your lifeline.
I've never had a debrief guest turn the debrief back on me. I love it.
Okay, this is fun. Okay, so what would be a common characteristic of someone who was a leader who brought out the best thinking and capability from others? That's one. Leaders who maximize the intelligence and capability of others. Two is, what's a characteristic of someone who, when they are inexperienced, ends up doing their best work?
Mm-hmm.
The third is, what's a characteristic of people who do incredibly valuable work and make an enormous impact? Okay, those are the three different domains. Like, let's just talk like, what would be the characteristics that would cause someone to excel in each of those situations? And Teddy, I only ask you because I actually think you're really, really smart. So I know a little bit about you and what you do and your background. You got this.
The first one is definitely somebody who can ask a question at the right moment that gets people to think in a completely different way.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I had a professor like that, where it was a small seminar, ethics and biotechnology, and Michael Sandel was a brilliant guy. And at the moment in that conversation where everybody felt like they were converging on the right answer, he would ask a question and it would just put everybody back on their heels. It's like, oh crap. And it just changed the whole tenor of the conversation. Mm-hmm. Jeff Weiner at LinkedIn did the same thing. I remember telling a story about how LinkedIn was progressing in terms of the number of members or the number of jobs that were posted on the platform. And in order to get to all of the jobs in the world, it was going to take them like thousands of years. So he was like, what would it take to dramatically accelerate our acquisition of jobs on the platform? What would we have to do fundamentally differently? And like that one question then unleashed a whole bunch of creativity and like completely different thinking across this team. And then 3-4 months later, different product strategy, and now all the jobs are on LinkedIn.
Super interesting. So when Jeff asked that question, what was your sense? Did he have an answer or did he not have an answer? Sometimes we ask a question, we're like, yeah.
No, I don't think he had
a question. We know the answer, but we're trying to get other people thinking.
I don't think he had the answer because I don't think he was close enough to the problem. Now I'm like really hypothetical.
But that was your sense.
But that was my sense.
Yeah.
He knew that there was a problem. He knew what they were doing now was not going to work. So just calling that out. Mm-hmm. What do we have to do differently? But that, like asking the question at the right moment.
And then what about like people who do well when they're new to something important and hard? Like what would be some of the characteristics that would cause someone to excel in like a rookie moment rather than flail in one of these moments?
Two things. one, asking for help, and two, doing it their way. Not the way that it's been done before.
Yeah. And then, we can go to this third domain, which are people who end up doing work that's inordinately impactful compared to other smart, hardworking, capable people.
Solving the right problem.
Yeah. And so it's like you look at what's common across these. Is there like, there's anything that like you see like, oh, this would be a trait that would be common across all these?
I feel like I just like developed an entire interview guide, by the way, for like the next set of execs that we're going to hire.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, it's kind of what we're doing is like looking for people who think a certain way.
Yeah.
And like lean a certain way. They have a certain orientation.
So what I'm then really curious about, we work with like really fast growing tech startups where they're adding new hiring managers and interviewers and everybody's moving super fast. You operated at Oracle, at massive scale. And one of the things you described was Oracle developed this kind of culture of hiring for a certain mindset. So in some way was able to scale across all of these interviewers and hiring managers a way of sussing out these kind of intangibles. How did they do that? Like, how do you scale that sort of approach? Like, was it part of your training curriculum or was it something else that enabled that to happen across, such a massive distributed team?
Well, in terms of how they scale that, we haven't got to quite this like trait that we're looking for because let me answer the question. We'll go back to that trait or we'll leave it a little bit of a mystery. But, Oracle was hiring for like a drive and smarts, but it wasn't just like check the box smarts. And so, I mean, their strategy wasn't really an interviewing strategy nearly as much as it was a hiring strategy. And so what they did is they went spearfishing. And so they would go into the top universities, and they had 17 that they hired from. I did not come from one of those universities, which I think gave me a really interesting orientation on joining the company, because I never felt like that I was in that target that they were hiring for. So they went to 17 top universities, and they went to the professors of the CS programs and the EE programs, and they're like, who are your top students? And not just who have the best grades, but who are the people who are asking good questions? Who are the people who like come and ask, what about this? And how about this? Who are the people who kind of go that extra mile? And then they just went and systematically recruited all of those people. And there was a hiring process. But I remember one of the questions that they asked, this was a Larry Lynn question. And you were told, like, if you're going to get, you're going for like an interview, with that final interview, you were going to be asked, are you smart? And Larry would just look you in the eye and say, are you smart? And how people answered that question apparently said something.
Huh. I would love to correlate what the answers were. Like the idea of like, apparently it said something, like what? And what answers? And like what, yes, is it the length of the answer? Was it how they described it? Like, how do you replicate that? That's where we're trying to get to. It's like this.
I wish I knew. I didn't. I mean, I kind of know how people answered that, but my guess is they were looking for people who could confidently say yes, but not didn't have to be a jerk about it.
I'm going to go back to something. You said you're bad at hiring. You've thought so much about it. We just ran this kind of like little exercise where you coached me through like what's most important. I've got an interview plan now. Why are you bad at hiring?
I'm bad at hiring. I'm bad at hiring because I like people.
Mm.
And, I'm one of these people who I'm highly optimistic, and I like people, which is a really bad combination in hiring, because I find something to like about every person I interview. And so I see like that potential, and I'm not looking at, okay, well, what does it actually look like? And so I have to guard against this all the time, because I kind of want to hire everyone. And, it's the same reason why I would make a terrible venture capitalist, because I'm like, oh, wow, that sounds like a great idea. You seem great. And so I've learned to like be very specific about what you're looking for, and to, go to behavioral-based interviewing techniques to figure that out. And I've learned that, and we do it across our own little firm, is we just sort of bring people in and test them out. Like, what I'm really good at is I'm good at spotting talent in action. So like I can watch people work, and in a fairly short period of time, I can see like the thought processes that go behind people work, and the habits and the assumptions. Like assumptions just come jumping out to me. So I've worked with someone for just even a couple weeks. I'll know right away, like, yeah, this person is going to be amazing in this role or not. So I've just learned I've got to experience it.
Okay, I'm going to go back. There was this common trait across types of leaders that we were driving toward. Let's not leave it a mystery.
Oh, and I see Kelly has asked this question, and Kelly,
thank you, Kelly, for having me on track.
Okay, want to venture a guess. So it's intellectual curiosity is what shows up really strong across all of these. It's the number one trait that differentiates multiplier leaders from diminishers. And so, someone who is intellectual, someone who's very smart and bright, isn't someone who's necessarily intellectually curious. They're, and we see this in like diminishing leaders. They're inflicting their ideas on others versus, so someone who's intellectually curious is someone who's more interested in what they don't know than what they do know. And it's the same trait that we see show up high in people who do well when they're new to really hard things. It's a trait we see that shows up in people who do work that's really impactful, because they're like, I wonder what my boss is trying to get done. Like, what's frustrating her? What is she not getting? What is her boss asking her about? Like, what's the best use of my time? Like, it's this curiosity of filling in what we don't know. And it's, in some ways, it's like, I need to find a research project that doesn't end in that answer. But I think that's one of the things that it's harder. To me, it's like a stem cell kind of trait. So many of the things that I've seen to be critical for kind of success in the modern workplace.
You kind of alluded to this on like the false positive. I like this person. I want to see the best in them. False positives can also show up in interviews because people can just like interview well. And I'm really curious if you've thought about systematic ways in which diminishers might show up really well in interviews. Like we make mistakes. We hire people who turn out to be diminishers. That's really costly. Are there things that like we should be looking for? And maybe actually before you answer that, for the folks who haven't read the book, you can define what a diminisher is, so we're aligned on that. And then I would love to carry this forward. Like what are the red flags where somebody might be showing up great in an interview, but there's still a big risk that they're going to turn out to be a diminisher for the team?
Well, I do think diminishers show up well in interviews. And one of the things we find is that they manage up really well, which is why it's sometimes hard to get this out of companies. But in short, a multiplier is a leader who uses his or her intelligence in a way that amplifies the intelligence of others. They're leaders around whom we get to be like as smart and capable as we want to be and can be. Diminishers are people who are often just so consumed with their own capability, they don't see the intelligence around them, and they have a diminishing effect. They end up shutting down insights, ideas, energy around them. And most people have had an experience working for a diminishing boss. Well, there's how do you find? You could either look at it, which is how define the question: how do you find multipliers, or how do you spot diminishers? Let me offer two things that might be helpful if people are looking to hire these kinds of leaders or people with this leadership potential into their organization. I want to share the favorite interview question on this is a question I got from Tom Friel, who is the former CEO of Heidrick & Struggles. And so he read the book Multipliers, and he's like, wow, this is, so he spent his whole career placing CEOs. And he said, wow, like this kind of captures the kinds of leaders I've been trying to hire and place into companies. And he shared one of his favorite interview questions. I love this question. And Teddy, you will love it because it's like, what are you looking for in this question? He would ask leaders, who were quite typically incumbent leaders in another company. So like, they're managing company A and he's trying to recruit them to company B. And he would ask this executive, he would say, tell me about your team. That was his interview question. And I'm like, okay, fascinating. And then what is he looking for? This just kills me because it is such a good question. And what he's looking for is timing. He wants to know how long this person can talk about their team. See, because in an interview, you're there to kind of like talk about you, your capabilities. He's like, hey, tell me about your team. Oh, well, we've got Sunir who heads up our, marketing efforts. We've got this. And he's looking for, do they move quickly off of their team and back to them, what they think, or can they talk at length about each person, what they do, their contributions, what they're good at, how do they feel about that person? So he's looking for other orientation, which is one of the critical capabilities that multipliers have. It's one of the defining differences is, are you thinking about yourself and your ideas? And like, do you go through your day like, okay, I have an idea. Let me go tell my team what I want them to do. Or like Jeff, are you like, I have a problem and I'm asking a question because I want other people's ideas. And it's like one of the fundamental differences is just how you walk about your day and where is your orientation.
It's fat. You shared with me in a previous conversation this experience you had with a manager who made a to-do list, but then on the flip side gave you a really valuable insight around reading novels. I would love if you'd share that because it feels like a great dovetail to this topic.
Yeah. So when I was new to management, it was my first management job, and I'm about 6 months, and I'm probably a hardworking person. Like I'm wound pretty tight, and I have a decent work ethic. And about I don't know, it was a couple months into this, and my boss, Rand, he stopped by my office and he sat down and he just sort of very awkwardly said, he goes, Liz, you can sit in your office and read novels all day long if you want, as long as your team is doing what they need to do. And then he kind of got up and left. And I'm like, what? Like, it was such a violation of my work ethic. Like, I wouldn't do that. Like, on work time, like, why would I sit and read novels? And first of all, I don't really read novels, but, and, and I'm like kind of a nonfiction person myself, but I was just like perplexed. And then it finally dawned on me what he was saying is your personal productivity doesn't matter. What matters is the productivity of your team. Like, get your orientation away from yourself and what you're doing and orient yourself on what the people around you are doing. That's where there's power of numbers. Like, do you optimize for one person's productivity or do you optimize for 10 people's productivity? Probably 10.
Yeah. I want to ask the flip question. We talked about diminishers can show up well in interviews. Is it possible for an impact player to not show up well in an interview? Like, do we get false negatives on this? Like, when we miss hiring an impact player, what are we missing? Like, what did we not? What were we not asking? What did we not see in the answer? Like, does it ever happen? Like, or do impact players just nail it in the interview all the time?
Oh, it's such a good question. I haven't thought about it, and I don't know the answer to that. I'll tell you what I do know, and at some point I want to go back to like some characteristics you can look for if you're trying to sort out multiplier versus diminisher, but we'll get back to that. So impact players are people who do work of extraordinary impact and influence and value, and there's a certain set of traits, and that was what the research was, is trying to identify those. So after I kind of built this model, which is what are the assumptions and practices of impact players, and looking at what are some of the core things they do well, and like at the very core of it is they tend to do well in ambiguous, uncertain situations. I compared these high impact players with what I called ordinary contributors, who managers described as they did their job, they did it well, they followed direction, they took ownership, they were focused, they carried their weight on teams, they were great, they were stellar in ordinary times. But what really differentiated the impact players is how they dealt with uncertainty and ambiguity and chaos in situations beyond their control. That they really excelled in these. And in some ways, they excelled by simply not avoiding them. They were willing to kind of dive into this ambiguity. And they excelled in these kind of 5 areas. I call them the everyday problems, because everywhere you go, you'll find messy problems that don't sit neatly in one person's department or job, unclear roles because, lots of people are working on it, not totally sure who's in charge, unforeseen obstacles, targets that move while you're shooting at them, and unrelenting demands. And they're not big crisis moments. They're just moments of uncertainty and ambiguity. And most people are like, I'm going to wait for direction. I'm going to hand that to a senior leader. It's out of my control. And impact players just sort of move into them. So I built this little behavioral-based hiring tool. And instead of like a star, situation, task, action, result, I came up with a SOAR, a situation, an orientation, an action, and a result. So I want to know, like in this situation when roles are unclear, like what's your orientation to this? How are you thinking about it? So I gave this hiring tool to one of my buddies. He's always a good test pilot for all of my wacky ideas. And he had 13 people he was hiring. He works at Rivian as a VP of talent development there. And he had about 13 people he had to hire in a month. And I gave him to him. I'm like, hey, Ben, why don't you try this out? See what happens. And he calls me up after 3 interviews. And he's like, wow, first of all, that really, really helped because I knew exactly what I was looking for. And he wanted to like really know how well does this person do in ambiguity. And, he's in a high growth organization. It's Rivian. They're building these, amazing electric trucks and utility vehicles. He then said, after doing these interviews, I wasn't totally sure who the impact players were, but I could tell who they weren't. Meaning, he could tell who was really uncomfortable in these kinds of situations. And for him, he said he learned to watch body language. When you ask someone, like, tell me about a time when, you had to deal with one of these really ambiguous situations. And he says, I noticed some people are like, ick, like, and they're stumbling through it. Like, you can tell they did not like this experience. Whereas other people were like, oh yeah, it was a total mess. Here's what happened. Like, this department couldn't do this. We couldn't figure out this. So I had to go in here and do it. And it was just watching for like, how enthusiastic were they about being in these kinds of situations? And so like, can you get, like, in some ways he's like, I'm not sure it's a positive yet, but I kind of know how to weed people out of that funnel. And I think that's probably a really important tip in finding people who excel in uncertainty and ambiguity.
What are there categories? I'm just thinking about, like, tactically, if somebody wanted to implement that approach, right? SOAR instead of STAR. Are there like categories of orientations, or are there like versions of what you would be looking for that you would differentiate one orientation versus another? Like, how would you be thinking about interpreting or analyzing what an answer around orientation sounded like?
Yeah, so I've got one of these. I've got one of these in the book. Let me see. I'm just gonna. This is like so old school, but the book doesn't come with a spiral binding. This is my special author edition of the book, so I can like keep it on my desk. But I offer an example of what this would look like, and the outlook or the orientation that you're looking for is like, if they're in a situation where this one here is, like a messy problem. Do they see this as a chance to be useful, or do they see it as a distraction from their job? Like, how are they looking at this? How are they talking about it? Like, oh, actually, no, I see opportunity in this, or do I see threat to me and my productivity in that? So that's, and, based on the framework in the book, it's pretty easy to lay out what are these contrasts. Are you looking for something that looks more like how an average contributor tends to see this, or how an impact player sees that? And boy, anyone listening to this who wants to do something with that, like, just give me a ring and I will talk that through with you. This is like still early days for me, so there's tons for me to learn about how to do this.
What you're getting at, I think, is really interesting, actually, which is hiring is difficult for lots of people, and it's not for lack of questions to ask. It's pretty easy to Google and find a whole bunch of interview questions, but this idea of how to interpret the answer, what to look for, what are the range of things I could be hearing, that's a thing that ultimately, like, people just gain through experience. Like, I've done this a lot. I've worked with lots of people. I've been in those situations, and so now I kind of know what to be looking for. And so I think one of the things that early leaders crave is like a mental shortcut for that. Like, how do I get good at that pattern recognition faster, earlier, so I can be more confident that I know what I'm looking for?
Yeah. And I feel like kind of where I've gotten to this is I'm pretty confident in the assumptions or outlook, kind of like the way we think about things, what those are, and the practices that differentiate solid contributors from impact players. Like, I'm pretty confident in this. Like, how, like, the exact questions to ask, this is something that I still think needs to be worked out, but I feel like at least it's like, these are the things that you want to look for. Do you see the presence of this kind of an outlook, this kind of a practice around this? And I do think if there's like a litmus test, like a sorting, like, initially it's probably, what is someone's orientation to just ambiguity, uncertainty? How well do they do in situations, or even how well, like, what do they feel when they're in situations that are out of their control and uncertain? Do they move toward them? And I don't think anyone likes ambiguity and uncertainty. Like I don't like it at all. But it's like, what is your orientation? Do you decide you don't like it and move away from it? Or do you decide you don't like it and move into it to provide certainty and clarity? Like, okay, this is a mess. Now we've got to put some clarity around this. We got to get our arms around this problem.
Yep.
And I think that is a pivot point that I've seen. Do they move toward it or away from it?
I'm going to shift gears just a little bit to put this conversation in the context of a lot of folks who are likely either dialed in live or who will be watching this, which are talent acquisition and recruiting leaders, thinking about how to architect a hiring and interview process. And right now, it's like, one of the most competitive markets for talent that we've ever seen. And so a lot of talent acquisition leaders are thinking about, how do we engineer an interview process to get the most signal out of the least amount of time that we can possibly spend with the candidate? Half the candidates are coming in, they already have another offer. Like I can't spend 10 hours with this candidate. I can only spend 2. What advice would you give to a talent acquisition leader, a functional leader, head of sales, head of engineering, who's thinking about trying to engineer an interview process to get the most signal out of it as fast as possible?
Well, if big caveat, like I feel like I am not an expert in hiring. Like my expertise is figuring out what are the mindsets and practices that lead to certain kinds of performance. So, if you're looking for multipliers, I feel like I've got that anatomy pretty well figured out, and the impact players, I've got that figured out. So it's like, build a behavior-based system, based hiring system around these practices. And the piece of intel that I would add to that is, know which of these practices are easily coached and trained and which are fairly innate. Like you kind of learned them at your mama's knee or you didn't. And that's what I'm really excited. Having done this research project, I realized, what I need to be able to offer readers, learners on this, like a sense of which of these are really, really difficult to build and coach, like which to start with. And I've got a little list in the book. It's a little sheet that looks like this. I'm happy to also put this out through this. It's like, I know that doesn't do anyone any good, but like if you are reading the book, look for it. It's on page 239. Teddy, I'm happy for us to pop that PDF.
We'll screenshot and put it in the blog post after.
And put that out in the blog post. But it's just a chart that shows the least coachable to the most coachable. Here's how I figured this out. The literature in psychology doesn't do a lot to say what mindsets are highly coachable and learnable and not. Like the psychologists tend to stay away from making declarations about this. So I went out to a group that I thought could make some declarations about that. And I went out to a group of executive coaches. And this is in the Marshall Goldsmith 100 organization. It's an organization I'm part of. So I asked these executive coaches, if you have experience helping leaders acquire some of these like practices and skills or mindsets, tell me, how learnable was this? Like, did someone have success trying to learn how to do it? Or was it something that like, you either got it or you don't? And some of the most coachable of the mindsets and practices are, let's just go to the least coachable, because these are the ones that you want to hire for. And that is an internal locus of control. Do I believe that I am in charge of the outcomes in my life? Like I control those events. Informality, meaning I don't have to be in charge to take charge. See, I would have put that over on the more coachable side. All you have to do is say, oh, by the way, you don't need to be the boss to like step up and lead. But I do think it's something that is quite cultural for people. Like, you either learned as a kid that, listen to mom and dad, they're in charge, you're to be seen, not heard. Your teacher is the one who decides everything. Or you were kind of raised with this sense of, no, like you can offer to be the leader, like you can. And so I think that is an orientation people come with, this opportunity lens that I've been speaking about. Do you look at ambiguity and see an opportunity to create value and clarity and progress and movement? Or do you look at that uncertainty and go, I'm going to stay out of it. It's like, that's quicksand. That's going to pull me down. You know, what the psychologist would call a benefit mindset. You know, I can improve well-being for all. Like I'm not just trying to improve things for me. I have sort of an orientation around a whole. On the behaviors, this ability to both lead and follow, this ability to ascertain what's important and what's important right now when it's not written down or handed to you. Like that's one that is a little harder to coach. And then here's my last one. I love this one, bringing a sense of fun and levity. Like I still want to put that over on the right side of the chart, which is like, yeah, just say like, hey, lighten up, everyone, have fun. Really hard to convince people to like not take themselves so seriously. And I want to put a plug in here for the multiplier diminisher framework on this, because at the last minute, I put has a sense of humor on the survey of the characteristics when we studied these leaders. And I did it purely because I did it for my mom, because I was voted class clown in my high school graduating class. And my mom was always like, my daughter's brought shit.
You need to prove her wrong, basically.
Yeah, oh yeah, definitely. I was like, see, Mom, look, there's something useful about having a sense of humor. It turned out that having a sense of humor was the item out of 67 items, the item that was most negatively correlated with diminishers. They're not fun. Like, and it's part of like they're taking themselves too seriously. And, you know, good leaders can usually laugh at themselves and be like, oh, don't worry about it. I screwed up like that too. Like, hey, you know, you have not done the worst. And it's this levity. And it's one of the things we find in these really high impact contributors is they bring a sense of levity and fun, which helps reduce the phantom workload.
There are people out there who will listen to this and they'll think, oh crap, I think I might be a diminisher if they have the self-awareness. Have you seen people make the transition from being diminishers to being multipliers?
Oh, I have all the time. The
Okay,
easiest
hope for us. There's hope.
There's hope. There's hope for people like me. The easiest transition, in some ways, these are changes that happen in a flash, in an epiphany.
Huh.
For the accidental diminisher, for the person who wants to be a good leader, cares about it, cares about their people, you know, is seeking actively to be a good leader, when they get exposed to the idea that most diminishing is accidental, you know, managers who rescue, optimists, people like me who are like, oh, this is going to be great. We're going to have success. This is going to be fun. Pace setting. And there's like 9 or 10 of these kind of behaviors that are such typical leadership things to do. They seem good on the surface, but have a diminishing effect when they get exposed to this idea and they're offered a workaround. It's like people like can reorient instantly.
Huh.
And it's not that they stop doing those things, but they're now aware of the diminishing effect. And they either kind of put a workaround in, or they build a multiplier skill or orientation, or the really smart, lazy ones do what I do, which is just announce to your whole team what your accidental diminisher tendencies are. Like for me, I'm a fountain of ideas. I know this about myself. Like, hey, what about this? Have we tried that? Have you thought of this? And I forget that people take these wacky ideas seriously, and then they go in. Is this you, Teddy?
100% me.
100%. Yeah. So this is me. And like one of the things you can do is be like, okay, I'm going into idea mode. I don't want to spin my people out. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to like get a piece of paper out and create a holding tank. Like I have a holding tank. And I ask myself, Liz, before you spout that idea, do you want the people who work for you to stop what they're doing and go work on this? And most of the times, the answer is no, of course I don't.
Yeah.
I just write it down. I have like, Teddy, I'm going to show this to you because if you're a fellow idea guy, I have this pile over here. This is like where ideas go to die. And I just stick them on a Post-it note. And then I kind of keep them on my monitor for a while. And if they're there for like 5 or 6 days, and I don't really want anyone to go do something with this, I just like put it in my pile. So that way, if I don't know, like we're bored someday, we could.
It sits right there.
And it's the kind of thing that when you're aware that your ideas become very confusing or feel like commands to others, you can catch yourself and go, okay, write it on an index card, put it in a pile. Or the lazier way to do this is to just tell your team, like, oh yeah, I'm a fountain of ideas. I get it. It's diminishing. Let's talk about how it's diminishing. We laugh about it. We tease each other about it. People tease you about it. And then what happens is then you've given someone on your team permission to say, Teddy, is this an idea that is on an index card, or is this an idea that you want us to like activate? Like, what is this? Is this pile of Post-its? And then you go, oh, you know what? You're right. And it's like, I think it's great. It's genius. It's like, you know what? Make it so public that people stop you from accidentally diminishing.
Yeah.
And I think it's the easier way to do it.
This is a very personal story, but when I was a kid in high school and like preparing for college, applications and whatever, my mom was like all over me about it. And every single time she like got all these ideas about like what my essays, I literally would just go like this to her, and she would just know that it's like, okay, yeah, no, cross the line, like he's got it, don't worry about it. But it was that. It was,
what is this?
I don't know, crazy eyes or I don't know, but it was just some wacky way to be like, lay off, like I got you, I hear you. But
so wasn't this? Yeah, it's a code. It's like a code word.
Totally.
Of like, okay, I've had it up like.
Okay. We have 3 minutes left, and Adam put a really great question into the mix here, which is a lot of what we're talking about is predicated on self-awareness. Or like I have to have the self-awareness to know that I'm doing this stuff. I want to change it. Or like, how do you test for that? Right? How do you understand whether actually somebody has self-awareness in the hiring process, in the interview process, when you're getting to know them early on, to be able to see if they have the foundation to be able to make these kinds of changes? Because nobody's perfect at the outset.
Yeah, no, and I think that self-awareness is one of those master skills. Like if someone has that, particularly in a leadership role, it trumps everything. And I would look for texture and richness. Do they like, oh, well, here's what I'm not good at as a leader. It's like, okay, can they describe how that plays out? Can they describe the gap between their intention and the impact that it has on others? Do they have empathy for what that does to people around them? Have they talked about it with people around them? Like, have they empowered people to say, yeah, I see your weakness. And I'm like, okay, like I want to look for like richness of understanding, richness of like, how communal is that? Because it is not enough for a leader to understand his or her weaknesses. Like that needs to be communal. And if it's not communal, it's not really addressable. I'm a big believer in like make awkward things owned by the community.
Fascinating. We are at time. Liz, thank you so much. This was super fun. I feel like I'm going to go rewatch this now and like literally build like a whole interview guide for like the next set of exec hires that we make, because there was like a bunch of gems in there. But Impact Players is out. Multipliers obviously is a massive hit. We got also create a book club and go read those as a leadership team. I'm pretty sure, because like we'll get a ton of value out of it. But thank you for being here. Super fun, really valuable. And yeah, I had a great time.
Well, Ted, it was great talking to you. I'll also send you a PDF for shopping for a new boss. And it's kind of a little bit of a guide, not necessarily for hiring a multiplier diminisher, but if you are leaving your job and you're going to go work for someone, like you want to know what kind of leader that person is. I don't think people should take jobs. I think people should take bosses. And so we'll send that, and that can go out in the PDF as well. But it was just so fun talking to you. Thank you for the Batman cave eyes. And I think Parker was the one who identified this as a Batman thing, which is
spot on. Cool. Thank you, Liz. Super fun.
Okay. Bye-bye.